I didn't become a Christian because of the evidence when I was 10 years old. My epistemological processes were not fully developed at that point. But I am a Christian today because the evidence.
Tonight, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Michael Licona back to The Ohio State University. I mentioned back because he's been here before. We actually had him lecture for us twice, and you can find those online a number of years ago. And then he did a debate. We partnered with Cru a ways back, and we did a debate where he debated Larry Shapiro, who's a philosophy professor at the University of Wisconsin. And you can watch that online. Mike did that Dr. Licona did that over to Mershon, and you can watch that online. He just debated, actually, Larry Shapiro again. That's online for Premier Unbelievable. So anyway, Dr. Licona is a well-known resurrection apologist. He's written a number of books. He's also a New Testament professor, most importantly, at Houston Christian University, which is a school you should look up online. He teaches a number of classes there. He's a full-time professor there. And that's in Houston, of course, but he doesn't really live in Houston. He teaches a lot of them online. But Dr. Licona also has a ministry called risenjesus.org. And you can find out a lot about him on there. A lot of the debates and his clips are on there, risenjesus.org. He lives just outside Atlanta with his family, and he's written a number of books. I just want to mention a few of them. If you just want to get started on the resurrection, learning about it, The Case for the Resurrection, he co-wrote with Gary Habermas, is a great book, great starting point. He wrote this a ways back. Great book. And then he published his dissertation, this book right here, The Resurrection of Jesus. It's only, 18 pages. So, you got nothing to do, a cup of coffee, sit down here. But this is just an amazing book. So I hope you guys can maybe get this and go through it someday. And then most recently, he's been doing a lot of work on the Gospels. He has a book called Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? Sometimes you run into people that, why is Matthew write it differently over here than Luke or Mark, whatever. So this is kind of a groundbreaking book he wrote. And he has a layman version coming, or like a newer version, or like a more accessible version, we might say, to some people, coming out in May on Zondervan. So look for that's coming out shortly. But he's really doing a lot of work on the Gospels these days, and that's a specialty of his as well. Dr. Licona has also debated Bart Ehrman many times online. You can watch his debates with Bart, who's a well-known New Testament skeptic. So, I've known Mike for a number of years, and does great work. So we're happy to have him back to The Ohio State University. I know he's happy to be here, so give him a warm hand.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks. It's good to be with you guys and back here again, and thank you for inviting me. Well, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was born into a Catholic family, and anyone who's familiar with Maryland knows that Maryland is heavily Catholic. And so almost the entire neighborhood was comprised of Catholics. But then we got a new neighbor in, and he was Protestant. And back in the 1960s, 1970s, they had Meatless Fridays, where you'd have fish, but you couldn't have meat. So every Friday, this guy would come home from work, and he'd go out back, it's Protestant, and he'd fire up the barbecue, and he'd throw a steak on there, and the aroma would just go all around the neighborhood, and the Catholics were just going crazy. And so every Friday, he would do this. And so finally, the neighborhood just got together behind this guy's back, and they said, we got to do something about this. What are we going to do? And so they came up with the idea, this guy come home this next Friday, fires up the barbecue, throws the steak on there, going around the neighborhood, the aroma. Well, they come into this guy's yard, and they grab him, and they take him down to the Catholic church down the street and put him in front of a priest who proceeds to try to convert this guy to Catholicism. For 3 hours, this guy worked on this Protestant. And finally, the guy just threw up his arms and said, okay, I will convert. I'll become Catholic. Just let me go. And the priest said, that's great. He said, you were born a Protestant. You were raised a Protestant. You are now Catholic. Go in peace, my son. And so the guy goes. Now, at this point, the rest of the Catholics in the neighborhood said, we don't have to worry about this anymore. So what's going to happen next Friday? Next Friday comes, the guy comes home from work, goes right out back, fires up the barbecue, throws on a big juicy steak. The smell's going through the neighborhood. So all the Catholics come to this guy's fence. They're looking over the fence and say, what is going on here? And just then they see him painting on the barbecue sauce saying, "You were born a steer, you were raised a steer, you are now fish." So, of course, that story's not true. I was born in Maryland into a Catholic family. And but my dad wasn't a good guy. He was an alcoholic. He mistreated my mom, hit her a couple times. And so finally, when I was 5 years old, she took off. She left him. It was a good thing. And so she's gone. She remarries. We move out to Baltimore County, and we start going to a Presbyterian church. And I remember I was 10 years old, and this one Sunday, they brought in this Christian magician. And this Christian magician, I had been asking, how do I get to heaven? You know, I'd been asking my mom, and she'd be saying, well, you just got to do more good than bad. Well, what if I do more bad than good because I know I've hit my sister and made her cry? And so, well, then you go to hell to be with the devil forever. And I'm thinking, well, where am I on that scale, you know? So they brought this Christian magician in, and he would do these magic tricks, and but he would relate the gospel message to those tricks somehow. And explain, and for the first time in my life, it just became illuminated to me. It's like, I understand it's not what I do. There is no scale like this. It's a matter of what Jesus did for me on the cross and by his resurrection from the dead. And in this Presbyterian church, this Christian magician gave an invitation, and there were about 50, 70 of us kids. And I remember there was 3 of us. I said, this is what I've been looking for. I've been looking for the answer. And I went forward, gave an invitation. I went forward. 2 other girls went forward. And that's the day I consider myself to have become a Christian. I got tricked into becoming a Christian.
Great stuff.
Well, I grew some spiritually as a teen, and then I went off to a Christian university. And for the first time in my life at a Christian university, I was in a really, really strong Christian environment. I'd gone to public schools all up until then in Baltimore, and so I was really thriving spiritually at Christian University. I was a music major at the time. I played saxophone, and so I was growing. Ended up in undergrad. I was spending probably an hour a day, at least in the scriptures, probably an hour to 2 hours a day in prayer. And I know that's really strange or odd for a college student, but I was just really into God. I wanted to grow. I wanted to know God. It was important to me. And so I decided at that point, well, after hearing a lot of people preach, and they mentioned how the original language of the New Testament was Greek and the kind of insights it would yield, I decided I wanted to learn Greek. So I took a first semester Greek in my final semester of college as an elective. I loved it. And so I was able to get into grad school on probation. My grades hadn't been the best. I tease, I say, I was a gifted student. When they gave me a C, it was a gift. My dad told me I have an average IQ. I'd share it with you, but I'd forgot what it is. So anyway, seriously, they let me on probation. I had to take a year's worth of Greek over the summer, but I aced that as well. And then I aced all my courses on Greek in grad school, and I just loved it. I was studying the New Testament hours every day in its original language, and I was into it. Until one day, for some reason, I asked myself the question, is this really true? How will I know if it's true? Now, yeah, I believe that I've had this relationship with the Lord, but then I got thinking, well, do Muslims feel the same way? Do Hindus feel the same way? Do Buddhists feel the same way? Do Jews feel the same way? Am I unique in the sense? Are Christians unique in the sense? Or do other people of other faiths have this kind of experience? How will I know if Christianity is true? And someone led me to Gary Habermas. I ended up co-authoring a book with him. But he was a philosophy professor. He invited me to his office. He shared with me some of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. It's like, okay, cool. 20 minutes later, well, you kind of satisfied me. You gave me the answers I was kind of looking for. And it just reinforced my faith. And so I was fine. So now what happens? So you fast forward a couple of years later, and now I'm starting to have doubts again. Well, I was looking just for affirmation, things to affirm what I already believed. But what if I had done a real investigation of the faith? What would that look like? Would I still come to the same conclusion? I found what I was looking for. I mean, this is something that happens in science all the time that leads to fallacious results. You're looking for something, and it just so happens you discover what you were looking for. But what if I was looking at this in an unbiased manner? Would I've come to a different conclusion? And so this started to really plague me. I started to have doubts again. And it was like, if Christianity is a false religion, if Jesus really isn't who the New Testament portrays him as being, I'm in a world of hurt when I die. If another religion like Islam is true, I'm in deep kimchi when I die if Islam is true. If Hinduism or Buddhism is true, no problem. I'm going to have many times to get this thing right, But, I might only get one chance at this. And what I was afraid of is that my biases would be so strong that they would prevent me from discovering truth and cost me eternity. That's what kept me up at night. And so I decided I wanted to go for a PhD in New Testament studies, and I really wanted to look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as best as I could from an unbiased. I wanted to find out, how do historians actually do historical investigations? And let's apply that to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, at that point, I had just finished co-authoring that book with Gary Habermas, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And I said to him at the end, I said, Doc, he had like a bibliography of, I think, 2,200 sources, 22 or 2,400 sources written by scholars at that point on the resurrection of Jesus between 1975 to the present. And I said, now that his bibliography is now up to, I believe, over 5,500 sources. And I said, all these different scholars, they come to these different conclusions, but they're looking at the same data. Why is that? Who are these scholars? He said, well, almost all of them are New Testament scholars, a few philosophers, and maybe just less than a handful of professional historians. And none of them had written extensively on it or anything exhaustive. I thought, wow, well, I think I'd like to do that. I'd like to learn how historians do their trade, and then I'd like to apply that to the resurrection of Jesus. So that's what got me interested in this topic for my doctoral work. So what I'm going to do in the next few moments here is I'm going to share with you, I can't go into everything that I wrote in that 700 some page book, okay? But I'm going to try to break this down for you, make it simple, maybe so simple a Southern Baptist can understand, okay? Just easy for you or a Southern Baptist. I should have said, so simple that even a Michigan Wolverine can understand. How about that? How about them Wolverines in football, huh? Just teasing, guys. All right, so let's just look at the facts. And we're going to start off with some preliminary issues about the practice of history. The practice of history. How do historians actually go about their trade? So I've got to go into some preliminary issues. So number one, good. This isn't working. Well, it was working. Hey guys, well, you want me to just point to you and... Okay. All right. Next slide. No, that's not it.
That's pretty good. That does. Listen. So, what's that? The PowerPoint crash.
Oh, okay.
So,
You want to hear a story about some of my travels? So several years ago, I was invited to go over and speak in Indonesia. And so I was in the province or island of Manado. And so I got up in the morning and went down to this really nice hotel, and I had breakfast down there. And so I'm finished, and I'm going to go back to my room, get ready to go out and speak that day. And as I get to the elevator now, in the breakfast area were all these Muslim women. Now, Indonesia, the most densely Muslim populated country in the world. So here I am in that hotel, and I'm all these women, in like their dark. I don't want to. They got head coverings and coverings over the mouth. I don't know what they're called, but anyway, so a lot of them at breakfast. So I go back to the elevator, and I push the button. I'm waiting for the elevator, and I notice that there's these 4 Muslim women who are walking over in my direction. They want to go up in the elevator too. So the door opens, and I get in, and they're coming. So I just hold the door open, and they get in, and they're just kind of nodding and smiling at me. And so the doors close, and we start to go up. And then I notice this one Muslim woman over here, closest to me, as we're riding up, she's like, I think this is strange. And she gets close, and then she goes, took a picture. And then and then all of them are just kind of looking at me to see how I respond. And I just kind of, and then they go, oh, they come get next to me. The door opens, they get off. They're kind of like this, smiling. Not a word was ever said. All right. So, the historian's objective is to present a historical description or a hypothesis that provides an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. I say essentially faithful representation because there's no way that we can get an exhaustive account. It would just be too long, okay? And we're not in, the historian's objective is, they'd like to get all the details correct, but that's rarely the case, that's going to happen. There's all kinds of challenges to learning about the past. So I'm just talking about historical investigation broadly here, okay?
Sweet.
Okay, still not working. I don't know. Oh, there we go. Maybe it is working. Yeah. All right, here we go. All right, so Richard Evans, he's a philosophy professor at Cambridge. He says that historians, it's kind of like we're looking through a window into the past. And the window is foggy, it's dirty, you can't always see clearly through that window, but we can get a decent idea perhaps of some things through that window. Some things are clearer than others. Another historian, I don't remember who it was, but they described historical investigation as like doing a jigsaw puzzle. You've got all these jigsaw puzzle pieces in there, and you're trying to figure out the solution to the puzzle. But the challenge is that you don't have the top of the box, so you don't know what it looks like. And then another challenge is you've got other jigsaw puzzle pieces from a different puzzle mixed in there. And so there's all kinds of challenges to learning about the past. Now, the historian's objective, as I mentioned, is to get an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. They are seeking probability, not proof in an absolute sense. The further you go into the past, as we were discussing a little earlier, the further you go into the past, it becomes more difficult to discern some of the things that happen. That's because you can talk about it like historical noise. It's like when I was a kid. I remember I got some walkie-talkies for Christmas one year. And there's no cell phones back in the 60s. That was just some, wish list. We'd like to have that sometime in the future. But no mobile phones. We had those they were real heavy black phones and rotary dials and stuff. So I got these walkie-talkies, and I gave one to my grandfather, and then I walked out of the house, and the further I went away, then some static came in. If you're close, well, then you can understand one another clearly. But the further you get away, some static gets in, and then finally you lose touch, and you don't even know what's going on. It's kind of that way with some things with history. The further we are removed from the past, there's like historical noise that gets in there. Things such as, our cultures are different. The way we report things are different literary conventions for writing history and biography now than there was back in the first century. And so trying to understand what they were doing and the cultural milieu in which they operated can be a real challenge and can lead to misunderstandings about what was actually said. I mean, take Jesus's statement in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, that if your right eye is talking about lust here, it comes right after about looking on a woman to lust for her. And he says, look, if your right eye makes you stumble, rip it out and throw it from you. Well, was he really saying to gouge your eye out? There's nothing in the text that would suggest otherwise. But why don't we do that? Well, Seneca the Younger, who was considered to be Rome's brightest mind in the first century, he said, if you need to rid yourself of vice, and if your heart is wicked, rip it out. Well, they're not really saying to do that. But what are they saying? Well, Paul rephrases that. The Apostle Paul, he says, consider the members of your earthly body as being dead to immorality, impurity, etc. So it's a whole thing, like pretend like you don't have a heart, then you can't have vice. Pretend like you're blind, then you can't look on a woman to lust for her. So, but if you misinterpret that, you could have all kinds of problems. In the early church, there were reports of men who were self-castrating because they took verses like that literally. You know, hermeneutical blunders can have tragic consequences. Perhaps the greatest challenge to learning the past are what historians refer to as horizons. Horizons are our worldview, are the way we look at things. It's based on our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our political, religious, and philosophical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attend, and the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. There's no way around this. We all have this, and it colors how we view different things. Again, historians refer to this as horizons. It's like putting on a pair of glasses, and every one of our glasses are tinted differently, and that's how we can look at the same stuff and arrive at radically different conclusions. Dale Allison, one of the top New Testament professors in the world, he teaches at Princeton. He is not an evangelical Christian, but here's what he says. Some we might think of as having no theological agenda are partly motivated by an animus against traditional Christian doctrine, which is in reality just another sort of theological agenda. The trite truth is that none of us is without philosophical bias or theological interest when we sit down to study Christian origins. Basically, what Allison is saying is that all of us are biased. It doesn't matter whether you're skeptical or a true believer. We're all biased, and it shapes the way we view things. Chris Lorenz, he's not a religion professor or anything. He's a historian, a philosopher of history. And here's what he has to say. A proper philosophy of history must elucidate the fact that historians present reconstructions of a past reality on the basis of factual research and discuss the adequacy of these reconstructions. At the same time, it must elucidate the fact that these discussions seldom lead to a consensus, and that therefore pluralism is a basic characteristic of history as a discipline. In other words, because of our interpretive polarities, there's many occasions, it's typical for historians to arrive at different conclusions and there not be any consensus. And folks, if this is the way it is with just general historical matters, then of course when it comes to things such as Jesus or any religious matter, you're not going to have any kind of consensus, at least on the conclusions. So when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, we cannot by any means expect a consensus among historians on whether he rose or did not rise. So to summarize, all historians have biases, and a consensus of historians is often absent. All right, so that's our preliminary matters. So let's look at a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. I'm going to base this on two major building blocks, facts and method. Now, regarding the facts, let's start with those. Gary Habermas likes to refer to what he calls minimal facts, facts that are so strongly supported by the data that they have compelled a at least a very strong majority, if not a universal consensus of scholars to grant them as facts. Now, Paula Fredrickson, who is a Jewish New Testament scholar up in Boston, she calls those historical bedrock. She says historical bedrock, facts past doubt. I like that term, historical bedrock, because what you want to do is you want to build a hypothesis on facts that are strongly grounded in the data, for which there is a very large consensus. It's pretty much the same as minimal facts. I just like that term, historical bedrock. That's the foundation of your hypothesis. Now, there are other facts that aren't so strongly evidenced. So, like, for example, virtually all scholars today, historians would say Jesus died by crucifixion in either the year 30 or 33. He died by crucifixion. Why? Because the evidence for this is just practically irrefutable. It's just beyond question. Now, I know that there'd be some people who would question whether Jesus died. There are people who question whether the Holocaust occurred. They question whether we landed on the moon. They question whether Jesus even existed. Okay, but these are just fringe folks. Richard Carrier, he's a warm acquaintance of mine. We've had 2 debates, good debates. He doesn't believe Jesus existed, but he can only name, I think he came up with a list of 40-some scholars who said that either Jesus did not exist or that it's worth examining. They think he existed, but it was worth examining. But of those, there were only 16. Of that, like 40-some scholars, there were only 16 who questioned whether Jesus ever existed. And 3 of those are dead. So there's only 13 living scholars, including himself, who questioned whether Jesus ever existed. 13 in the whole world. I mean, that is really, really a very small fringe. And most scholars, even atheist New Testament scholars, laugh at such a position. What I'm saying here is the evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion is really good. It's pretty much beyond doubt. And only a few way out there on the fringe even would question it. But as you go up, something like maybe Jesus walking on water, we actually have some pretty good evidence, historical evidence that happened. But it's not as strong as Jesus' death by crucifixion.
Okay.
Jesus' virgin birth might be way up here. We have some evidence for it, but it's not as strong as him walking on water. It's not as strong as his death by crucifixion. So what you want to do, right now, I'm only going to consider facts that are historical bedrock. Okay? So these are things which virtually every scholar agrees on. So let's look at what some of those facts are. Here, I got to draw a little narrative for us, all right? So Jesus' death by crucifixion, it's either in April of 30 or April of 33. I kind of lean a little bit toward 33. Scholars are split 50-50, but just to make it easy, 30 is a round number. Let's go with 30, okay? It really doesn't matter. Most scholars believe the Gospels were written, Mark between the years 65 and 70, Matthew and Luke between 70 to 85, and John written between 90 and 95. Now, not all scholars agree on that. Some will date these Gospels earlier, some later. I'm just telling you where most scholars are on these things. It doesn't even really matter for the sake of where I'm going. I just want you to know where scholarship is on this stuff. And then I want to focus on that period between Jesus' crucifixion and before the first gospel was written, which most scholars do think is Mark.
Damn it.
Paul, here he was, a Jewish Pharisee. He was against the church. He believed Jesus was a false prophet. He believed he was a failed Messiah. And he believed that the Christian sect was heretical, and he believed that he wanted to destroy it, and he wanted to be one of God's tools to destroy the sect. So he was out by his own word. He was out persecuting Christians, arresting them, throwing them into prison, consenting to their execution for being Christians. Now, we have 13 letters in the New Testament that have been attributed to Paul. Of these, scholars, and I'm talking about atheist, agnostic, Jewish, Christian scholars, they are unanimous that Paul wrote at least 7 of those 13 letters. And then of the remaining 6, probably there's 2 of them that scholars are 50-50 on. And then the other 4, the majority of scholars would say Paul did not write them. Maybe one of Paul's disciples wrote them. I'm not saying whether scholarship is right or wrong there. I'm just saying that's where the majority of scholars are today. But to make things as tight as possible, I'm only going to appeal to those letters for which there is a unanimous consensus among scholars that Paul actually wrote them. Okay? One of those is the letter that he wrote to the church in Galatia. And Paul says in chapter 1 that 3 years after his conversion, which was somewhere between 2 to 5 years, probably 2 to 7 years after the crucifixion, 3 years after his conversion, Paul says he visited Jerusalem and he met with Peter, the lead apostle there, and spent 15 days with him. And he also saw James, the brother of Jesus. Now, when Paul says he met with Peter and spent 15 days with him, the Greek word he uses there is hysteresis. What English word do you think we get from that? History. So Paul wants he wants to get a good accounting of Jesus. Peter, tell me what it was like to be with Jesus. I knew some things of what he was teaching. That's why I was persecuting the church before. But tell me some of these other experiences. I heard that Jesus walked on water, and then you went and you sank. Is that true? Did he really raise a guy named Lazarus from the dead? That would have been pretty cool to have that kind of conversation. And then Paul says 14 years later, Bart Ehrman even says, and Bart Ehrman, we've had 7 debates together. We're friends. He refers to himself as an agnostic atheist. And Bart says, Paul was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, and Jesus' own brother, James. These are 2 good people to know if you want to know anything about the historical Jesus. I wish I knew them. So this is pretty big that Paul is meeting with Peter and James. But then in Galatians chapter 2, he says 14 years later, he goes back up to Jerusalem, and this time he meets with the pillars of the church, and he names them Peter, James, and John. So it's the second time he's now meeting with Peter and James, and the first time he's meeting with John, the son of Zebedee. So Peter and John were 2 of Jesus' 3 closest disciples, and then you have James, Jesus' brother. That'd be awesome 3 people to meet with. And Paul says the reason he was going up there is because he wanted to run the gospel message he had been preaching to make sure that he was preaching the same thing they're preaching. And Paul says they added nothing to my message, what I've been preaching. They extended the right hand of fellowship. In other words, fist bump, Paul. Keep up the good work, brother. Now, I have to admit, that sounds pretty good, but as a historian, you got to say, well, was Paul telling the truth? How do we know that he was telling the truth rather than he was just saying this to give himself some credibility? Well, this is why we look at some corroborating data. And so, the Apostle Peter probably had a disciple named Clement of Rome, and the Apostle John probably had a disciple named Polycarp. Now, some of you are going to get married later on. You're going to have kids. You're going to think of some names. So this is benefit for you. Polycarp, okay? Just keep that in mind if it's a boy. All right, so you got Clement and Polycarp, probably disciples of Peter and John respectively. So would it be interested to see how are they actually speaking about Paul? Because both are writing after Paul died. Well, Clement of Rome refers to him as the blessed Paul and places him on par with his mentor Peter. Polycarp says, and I quote, that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth, and then he quotes from Paul's letter and refers to it as part of the sacred scriptures. Well, these aren't the kind of things you say about Paul if he was teaching something differently than Peter and John. But it is precisely the kind of things you'd say about Paul if he was telling the truth, that they had verified and certified that he's on message with what they're preaching. Now, with that in mind, wouldn't it be awesome then? We know some of Paul's letters that he did write have been lost. Like, for example, in Colossians, he refers to the letter that he wrote to the church at Laodicea. What? That's not the New Testament. 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about a letter he previously wrote to them that we don't have. So our 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians, and we don't have 1 Corinthians. What if we discovered that letter? Wouldn't that be cool? What if we had one of these lost letters of Paul, like the church at Laodicea, and he says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. Wouldn't that be cool? Because then it's like, well, you wouldn't even need the gospels or anything like that to learn what the disciples were preaching, whether they were proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus, because you'd have it right here. Well, we don't need such a letter because we already have it. And it's one of those undisputed letters. It's 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians, which is written somewhere between the years 53 and 57, so it's very early. Here's what he says. I want to remind you, brethren, of the gospel message I preached to you. And now in the next few verses, he is going to say, first, I delivered to you what I also received. Now, what does that mean? These were two technical terms for that connoted the imparting of oral tradition. Now, oral tradition, we must not confuse that with today. Today, we don't do oral tradition in our Western culture, because we've got all kinds of, we're literate, we've got all kinds of recording devices, we don't need memory. But back in the first century, there's only maybe 10% could read, and maybe only half of those could write. The books, they were extremely expensive. The average person could not afford that. So the way people learned was through word of mouth. And so they were educated this way. The rabbis did it. Lots of people did it this way. We had disciples and you would teach them and they would memorize certain concepts. They'd memorize certain things. Some things would be verbatim. Other things would just be concepts or getting the gist, what it was essentially saying. Paul's talking about oral tradition here. So I delivered to you. When? Well, he's talking about this in 1 Corinthians, which is written between 53 and 57. And most scholars think, based on the chronology we have in Paul's letters as well as the book of Acts, that he established the church in Corinth in the year 51. So I delivered to you in 51 what I had also received beforehand. When did he receive it? We don't know. We can guess, but all it is a guess. We certainly know that it's before 51. So it's somewhere between Jesus' crucifixion and the year 50, let's say. And then he's going to talk more about what this says. I delivered to you what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. Now notice there's something called parallelism here, long, short, long, short. That was to assist in memory. So again, we can see you got the marker there, delivered and received, and now parallelism, this clear sign that it is oral tradition. Death, burial, resurrection, appearances, and then he names the appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time, and then Paul adds a parenthetical statement. Most of these people are still alive, however, some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And then Paul says, last of all, he appeared also to me. So notice something here. We've got 3 individual appearances, and look who they are, Peter and James. He met with them twice. And then he lists himself as an eyewitness. And then we have 3 group appearances. We'll come back to the group appearances because they're very important. And then Paul says, whether I or they, that is the other apostles, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. So we've got Paul saying, this is what the Jerusalem apostles are preaching. He's got this oral tradition that would have come down from the Jerusalem church, of which Peter, James, and John were the pillars. So this is the apostolic preaching. We know that Jesus' apostles were proclaiming the death, burial, resurrection, and multiple appearances to individuals and to groups, friend and foe alike. That's pretty cool. You can get there without any of the Gospels. So even if you want to say the Gospels, we don't know who wrote them, but written by biased authors, they got all kinds of contradictions. They were written too long after the events they purport to describe. They weren't written by eyewitnesses. If you want to use all those arguments from the skeptics, you still got to contend with this. And that's why virtually 100% of even skeptical historians studying this agree that Jesus' apostles were proclaiming that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. They had some sort of experiences. We can only guess what those experiences are, they'll say, but we know they did have experiences that they believe were the risen Jesus. And why is it that not only they were proclaiming it, but also they believed it? Well, because we know that they endured great persecution for their preaching. Now, in a lot of the reports about what happened to the apostles come much later, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, and even beyond that. And some of them are so fantastic of what happened to them. And it's like, I don't know, I have a hard time believing that. Like the martyrdom of Polycarp, the disciple of the apostle John, the son of Zebedee. It said that the way he was martyred was they were going to burn him alive at the stake, and they weren't going to tie him to the stake. They were going to nail him to the stake. And Polycarp said to the Roman soldier, "Don't nail me. My love for the Lord will keep me here." And so the soldier said, "Okay." And so they don't nail him to him. They set the pile on fire, and they see these flames, but it's not consuming Polycarp. In fact, a real nice aroma as though baking bread comes from it. And so the Roman soldier takes a spear and stabs Polycarp. And when he pulls it out, so much blood comes out from Polycarp that it puts out the fire.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the Christian accounts of martyrdom like that aren't unique. You have that with Jewish martyrs as well. Just read 2 Maccabees chapter 7, and you'll see what I'm talking about, just as an example. So some of it is really far-fetched, and we'd say, well, maybe something happened. Maybe these stories got embellished, amplified in order to hopefully encourage fellow believers who may face a similar fate that they can make it through it. Maybe that's why they did it. But that said, we've got 5 sources from the 1st century alone that all we need. So you got Paul's letters where he says that he and the other apostles are being persecuted. They face death on a daily basis. You've got the book of Acts, which talks about the persecution of all the apostles and the martyrdom of James, the son of Zebedee, as well as Stephen, and then a leader in the early church. And then you've got the Gospel of John that mentions the death of Peter. Now, if John, most scholars think, was written somewhere between the years 90 and 95. History shows that Peter was executed around the year 64, 65. So when John is later reporting that Jesus and Peter are walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection, and Jesus tells him that he's going to be crucified later on, that Peter's going to be crucified and die to glorify the Lord. Well, John is just reporting something that happened 25 years earlier, 35, whatever, however it was earlier. So he's referring to the martyrdom of Peter. Josephus mentions the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus, and First Clement mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. So we know that these disciples were being persecuted. We know that several of them were martyred from their faith. Now, that doesn't mean that what they believed was true. Because we know many Muslims are willing to die for their faith, Hindus are willing to die, Buddhists are willing to die, atheists are willing to die for their worldview, at least many of them. So it doesn't mean that those worldviews are correct, but it does mean that those people who are dying for their worldviews believe that those worldviews are correct, right? Liars make poor martyrs. So we know that the disciples were not only proclaiming Jesus rose from the dead, they actually believed it. And by the way, there's a big difference between, let's say, a Christian or a Muslim who dies today as a martyr and the disciples dying as martyrs. Because Christians who die as martyrs today die for what they believe is true, but for all we know, it could be false. Same thing with Muslims. They would die in jihad today for something they believe is true, but for all they know, could be false. The disciples were dying for what they were claiming Jesus rose and appeared to them. They either knew it was true or knew it was false. So they were either dying for something they were convinced was true or dying that they knew was false. And you might get 1 or 2 of them dying for something they know is false, but all of them being willing to suffer and willing to go to their deaths for something they know is false, that seems unlikely. All right, what did they mean by resurrection? What did they mean by it? Well, you got some that assigned it some different meanings, like John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, George Nicholsberg, Stephen Patterson. They'll say, well, they're just using it as a metaphor for, maybe it's Jesus is the most, resurrection was used as just a metaphor, a way of saying that God had exalted that person in heaven as a Jewish martyr. That's what it was about. Well, number one, I would say, give me some evidence that it was ever used in that sense, because they're just making an assumption. But here's another thing. I think that's the most easily refuted position, period. You've got Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, same chapter, verse 20. Now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. In other words, the first to be raised from the dead in a resurrection body. He's not the most recent of the Jewish martyrs to get in a long line of Jewish martyrs that was exalted by God. No, he's the first to be raised from the dead with a resurrection body. So then that leads to a question, well, when are believers going to be raised? Well, Paul answers that 3 verses later. He says, now each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then those who belong to Christ at his coming. So Jesus raised back in April 30 or 33, and then believers raised when Jesus returns. All right. Then he says, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So he gave life to Jesus' mortal body. He will also give life to our mortal bodies. And then just a few verses later, he speaks when Christ returns, what will happen is the redemption of our bodies. So it is a physical resurrection. Just as Christ was raised, we're going to be raised. We're going to be raised physically, bodily. So obviously, Paul is saying Christ was raised physically, bodily. The apostles meant for Jesus' resurrection to be understood as a historical event. It really happened. Here's what Paul, again, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says, look, if the dead are not raised, and the context is there were some people in Corinth who were saying, you Christians are crazy. There's no resurrection. Once you die, that's it. So just live life to its fullest now, because there is no afterlife. And so they're asking Paul about this, and Paul says, look, if the dead, believers, are not going to be raised, then Christ was not raised. Why? Because it was the general resurrection that began with Christ, and then we're part of that general resurrection later on. The two are inextricably linked. So if one doesn't happen, the other didn't happen. So if the dead are not raised, then Christ was not raised. And if Christ was not raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. Then also those who have died in Christ have perished. Now, a few years ago, my wife said to me, she said, Mike, if Christianity turned out being false, I think I'd still want to be a Christian because I like the teachings of Jesus. What do you think? And I said, if Christianity's false, I'm going to go have some fun. And she said, well, that's not a very Christ-like thing to say. I said, Paul said it. Because he goes on and he says, look, if I fought wild beast in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So his basic argument is this. If Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, this life is all there is. But Christ was raised. Therefore, we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. Now, that argument makes no sense whatsoever unless they're saying the resurrection actually occurred. It wasn't a metaphor. All right, so let's review our facts. Jesus died by crucifixion. A number of his disciples had experiences they interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to them. The risen Jesus is said to have appeared to groups. Paul had an experience he interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. The apostles believed Jesus was raised physically, bodily, and the apostles believed the resurrection of Jesus is historical. Those are our 6 facts. And any hypothesis that is worth its salt has to account for these facts. That's facts. So now let's look at method And this goes really quickly. It wouldn't if I had to get into everything here with method, but I'm going to make it really simple. So historians have different tools, and they usually use inference to the best explanation. That's the best way to go about it when comparing hypotheses. What you do is you take your historical bedrock, and then you formulate hypotheses, multiple hypotheses that attempt to account for these. And the hypothesis that can best account for the facts is regarded as what probably occurred. So, this is give you an example. Facts here. Resurrection. Resurrection hypothesis. Does it account for Jesus' death by crucifixion? Sure. You have to have a death before you've got a resurrection, right? Does it account for the appearances, the beliefs of the disciples there, that they had experiences of the risen Jesus who had appeared to them? Well, yeah, of course it accounts for that. What would it account for if Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to others? Would it account for why groups claim to have seen him? Sure. Would it account for why an enemy of the church, the skeptic Paul, came to believe that the risen Jesus appeared to him? Yes. Would it account for why it was physical? Yes. Would it account for why they believed it was historical? Yes. We can see the resurrection hypothesis does a very good job of explaining the historical bedrock. Now, there are other kinds of objections. Perhaps the most popular when skeptics will give a natural explanation would be the hallucination hypothesis. And this seems like it would be reasonable. I mean, after all, if someone is grieving the loss of a loved one, we can understand or just imagine that they would experience a grief hallucination of that person. My dad experienced a grief hallucination a few months after my mom died. Thought he saw her at night. Okay, the psychological literature that had been written for more than a century, over a century, are pretty unanimous in saying that grief hallucinations are fairly common. Now, there are different kinds of hallucinations. You could see something that's not there, hear something that's not there. Maybe you heard that dead spouse call your name, but they really didn't. You just had an auditory hallucination. Smell something, taste something. Maybe you have this experience of motion, like probably every one of us in this room has had a dream that we were falling and we woke up. That is called a kinesthetic hallucination. Remember when you got your first mobile phone and you put it on, this is called a tactile hallucination. You take your mobile phone, you put it on vibrate. When you go into a meeting, stick it in your pocket. In the middle of the meeting, you thought you felt it or heard it vibrate, you pull it out. Nobody loves me. False alarm, right? You thought you got this text, but you didn't. That's a tactile hallucination. We all experience them. Well, the group most likely to experience a hallucination are people grieving the loss of a loved one. Only 7% of them experience a visual hallucination. Most of them, 39%, experience a hallucination where they sense that person's presence, but they don't hear, see, smell, or anything. They just sense that they're in the room. Only 7% think that they see him. 7%. Yeah, so that's that. Here's another thing. Group hallucinations. There was a book written by Ehlman and Laurie back in, I think, 2006 or 7, published by the American Psychological Association, titled Hallucinations, the Science of Idiosyncratic Perception. It's a textbook on hallucinations. So I read it, and then I emailed the authors after, and I said, why didn't you guys deal with group hallucinations? They said, we couldn't find a single documented case that could be corroborated that of a group hallucination. And you think about it for a moment. And I said this to one of the authors. I said, well, how could you ever have a group hallucination? Because hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality. So they're like dreams. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. You can't do that, right? If I gave each and every one of you in this room right now a sleeping pill and said, let's go to sleep, and I want us all to dream that we're in Maui, how many of us would actually have a dream we're in Maui? Certainly not all of us, only a fraction of us. And how many of those dreams would be so similar that we all thought we were participating in the same dream. You see? You can't have a group hallucination convince, oh yeah, we all saw him and this is what he said to us. So you got problems. Does it account for Jesus' death? Yes. Because that would put them in a state of grief to make them candidates for hallucinations. But it doesn't account for the appearances. It doesn't account for, you might have one appearance, one, maybe two out of the 12. Well, Judas kills himself, so you got 11. You may have one, maybe two, who are hallucinating appearances of the risen Jesus, if we're looking at the 7%, but you're not going to have 100%. And then the group hallucinations, no. But yet you got 3 group appearances in that early tradition in 1 Corinthians. He appeared to the 12, to more than 500, to all of the apostles. So it's not just one, but it's 3 group appearances. And that's not even looking at the others that are reported in the Gospels. It doesn't account for the appearance to Paul, because Paul would not have been grieving Jesus' death. As I said, Jesus was, in Paul's eyes, a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. It wouldn't have led them to believe that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead. It would be more likely to convince those who had experienced the hallucination of Jesus that he'd been raised spiritually, but not physically. And then it could account for why they believed that the resurrection was historical, though, if they truly believed he'd been raised from the dead. So we can see that of the 6, it only really can account for 2 of the 6, whereas the resurrection hypothesis accounts for all 6. That's just one of the criteria. The others, resurrection does better on all the other criteria as well. So at the end of the day, the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation of the widely agreed upon facts. Put your worldview aside just for a second, put your theology aside for a second, just look at it as a historian, and the resurrection hypothesis wins. It's not even close. Now, you can reject it on philosophical grounds or theological grounds. Maybe you're a Muslim, maybe you're a Hindu, and it just doesn't jibe with your theology. All right, but on historical grounds, resurrection hypothesis makes far more sense than any other hypothesis. And that makes me excited. It really does. Because if Jesus actually rose from the dead, then it means Christianity is true. It means God exists, that he loves us, and that the stories that Jesus came down to help us, to solve the human problem. And that gives us hope. We're not here alone. He loves us. He wants to reconcile us to God, and we can have eternal life with him. So it's pretty cool stuff. So how about if we open it up for some questions now?
When you go to the market, the microwave questions. Should be, I don't think, I think it's lost, and to turn lost to us.
Yeah, I promise I won't embarrass anyone.
That's the feet. That's the 2.
I don't think it's on.
Test.
It might just need to be switched on from the mic.
Yeah, you switch it off the butt, but
There we go.
Test. Okay. What's the best argument you've heard against the resurrection, and how do you refute it?
I think the best one I've heard, and if I weren't a Christian, the one I would take would be, there just isn't enough evidence to convince me. There was a Jewish scholar a few years back. He's now dead. His name was Geza Vermesh. And he wrote a book. I think, I don't know that it really, it was almost published before it should have been, because he really didn't have any answers. And what he did was he laid out the evidence. It's a real short book. He laid out the evidence and he says, I see 6 possibilities. First, Jesus rose from the dead. And then last, he called it an inveterate skepticism that would say, I'm not going to believe no matter what. Resurrections just don't happen, so I'm not going to believe it. And then, some of these others, they lied, they hallucinated. I forgot what the other 2 were. And he said, you know what? We can dismiss the resurrection right off because that just takes faith. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Have you read N.T. Wright's book? Have you read any of these other stuff? And, I'm studying this long enough that no, it's not just a matter of faith. You can put good historical stuff. And then he says we can dismiss inveterate skepticism as well. So, well, you may put aside inveterate skepticism, but if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then their bullheadedness and saying, well, it just can't happen, well, they're right. They might be right for the wrong reasons, but they're still right. You just can't dismiss that because you think they're naive. And then he just rules out these other four. He just dismantles them and says, well, we know it's not any of these either. So he just says, I don't know what happened. So I think he dismisses these he's right on. These four he's right. I think he dismisses these naively and too quickly, these two. But I would do something similar to him. I would just say, yeah, I'd try to be honest and I'd say, well, the evidence points to the resurrection of Jesus, but it's just not enough to convince me. Yeah, that's where I'd go with it.
Thank you for your lecture. You mentioned Josephus and Clement wrote about some of the martyrs, the martyring of the apostles. I was wondering if they also had something to say about the resurrection itself and a little bit more about that. I listened to your debate with Shapiro, and I didn't hear anything, so I was curious about that.
About what Josephus says?
Yeah.
So Josephus mentions Jesus in two texts. Book 18, section 63 is the hotly disputed text. And then in Book 20, section 200 of Antiquities of the Jews, where he mentions the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. That one's pretty much an undisputed text. The disputed text, the reason it's disputed is because in that text he says that Jesus, he attracted both Jews and Gentiles. He performed many astonishing deeds. He was the Messiah. And at the instigation of the Jewish leadership, Pilate crucified him. But 3 days later, he appeared to them, and the tribe of Christians remain to this day. So Origen in the 3rd century writes that Josephus was not a Christian, and Origen's an early church father. So if that's the case, and there's no reason to believe that Josephus was a Christian, in his autobiography, he mentions nothing about being a Christian. So no reason to think that he ever became one. So if that were the case, why would he say he was the Messiah? Something like that. So most Josephus specialists today don't think that Josephus wrote all of that. But most of them do think that Josephus wrote about Jesus there. In fact, I asked Louis Feldman, this was back in, I think, 2000 or 2001. He's now dead. Feldman was the leading Josephus scholar in the world at that time. Not a Christian. He was Jewish. And he said, I asked him, I said, you published a book back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, on where Josephus specialists stand today on a variety of topics. And you said, by far, most Josephus scholars believe that Josephus mentions Jesus on these two occasions. Some people are saying today that the majority of Josephus scholars don't think that Josephus mentions Jesus in either of those texts. What do you think? And he said, well, I haven't done a bean counting, but from the people I know who are specialists, he said, almost all of them would say he mentions him in relation to James, the brother of Jesus, right? In Book 20, section 200. The other one, he said, most Josephus scholars do think that Josephus mentions Jesus there, but he didn't say he was the Messiah, and he didn't say he rose from the dead. Now, some other, moderate New Testament scholars, like Gert Tyson and Annette Mertz, think that he mentions that the disciples claimed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. And that makes more sense to me. So Josephus, in my view, he probably mentions that the disciples were claiming Jesus rose from the dead, but that's as far as you'd go with it. And the reason I think that that's the case is because we know the disciples were claiming it, and we know that Josephus was growing up in Jerusalem because he was born in the year 37, just 4 to 7 years after Jesus' death. And he was the child of a popular Jewish priest named Matthias. So this places him chronologically and geographically in the location where the apostles would have been proclaiming the resurrection of Christ as their primary message. And so it's plausible, even perhaps probable, that he mentions the resurrection there. Only that the disciples were claiming it, though, not that it actually happened.
Actually,
Thank you. Thank you for the beautiful presentation.
It was beautiful, wasn't it?
Yeah. I was still confused as to how all this can mean that something that's naturally impossible can happen in nature.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether that reduces to an argument that whether God exists or not.
Well, first of all, the laws of nature tell us what typically go on in our universe when it's left to itself, right? So if I were to take this pen, let's say, and I drop it, law of gravity, right? I could do that 1,000,000 times over and the same thing's going to happen. Now, I'm going to treat you all to something very special here tonight. You're going to remember this because this is going to be absolutely amazing. Are you ready for this? Isn't that amazing? It didn't drop. Why? Because my hand entered the scene and altered the normal course of events. What a miracle is, it's not a violation of the laws of nature. It's not an exception to the laws of nature. It's just simply an instance when the hand of God enters our universe and alters the normal course of events. It's not left to itself. Nature is not left to itself. Also, if God exists, the creator and sustainer of the universe, if he can do that and give life to us, then why couldn't he raise someone from the dead? It would be unlikely by natural causes, but the God who created natural law could certainly change something whenever he wanted to.
Okay. But the thing is that natural law is a law because it cannot be broken or nothing can interfere in it.
Oh, no,
So
that's not true. There are other laws. I mean, you have to show that the laws of nature are indefeasible. And there are some, like the law of conservation of energy, where they would say that some scientists would say that is indefeasible. But then there would be others who say, no, all laws of nature are defeasible. Philosophers of science would say that. So listen, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a philosopher of science. I couldn't tell you the difference between a K-Mason and a quantum fluctuation. I'm a historian, and historians focus on terra firma, where life occurs. And so you've got philosophers of science who are operating up in the clouds, and some say the laws of science of nature are indefeasible. Some of them are, at least, and others saying, no, they're all defeasible. Well, I don't know. I'm not a philosopher of science. But when I see really good testimony of miraculous events that have happened, even in our present day, I look at that and say, well, I'm going to go with the scientific position that is in concert with what I observe happening within our reality on terra firma.
Okay, but I'm not aware of any laws of nature that are defeasible, like you said. Is the law of conservation of energy not applicable everywhere in the universe? Is that what you mean?
I don't know. When I say that, some say that laws of nature that some of the laws of nature are indefeasible, and they usually talk about the law of conservation energy. But then they'll also say that some laws of nature are defeasible. Again, I'm not a physicist, so I really can't go beyond that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's physically impossible. So if there's a natural law that would allow it, then that wouldn't be a natural law. It would be something that's interfering in the physical world from the outside, and that's not a physically possible thing.
So I guess it's how we would define a law of nature then, right? If a man died, was brutally executed, let's say he was beheaded, and let's suppose you saw it, you witnessed it, and then you saw the next day this same person was alive and maybe had a scar here. Would you say that goes against the laws of nature?
Of course not. No.
No?
No.
Okay. So what would you call it then? Would you call it a miracle?
This is the exact example of something, say, like a magic trick. You would see that everything, you're looking at the entire trick and you wouldn't see anything wrong. But only the performer knows that there is a trick, and you'd either just believe in it or say, no, this is entirely impossible. There is a trick, because it's physically impossible.
So you're saying there's no amount of evidence that could convince you that that really happened then?
Yes, and there are good reasons for that.
Why?
Like, there are physical and mathematical reasons that the laws of nature cannot be changed, or
So if the God who created the laws of nature and if he created all this stuff, are you saying that he can't do anything? Even God could not come in and change things.
Well, yeah, the thing is that the laws of nature cannot be created.
How do you know that?
Well, let's say if you go back to the creation of the universe at the beginning of time, for example, that's where everyone thinks that the constants of nature get their values and the laws of nature get their form. Then before that, there is no possibility, there is no space for God to exist and create those possibilities.
If God is immaterial, though, he's spaceless and he's timeless, so he doesn't need that.
Right, but the only immaterial thing there is before the beginning of the universe is the multiverse.
You don't know
And
that.
that's a
There's no evidence for the multiverse. It's a possibility, but that takes a leap of faith to believe that.
Well,
It's also material.
it's I don't think it's material, no. Because when the universe is created, it's like one of an infinite number of possibilities, and when infinities and eternities are introduced, you cannot introduce anything beyond those. So this is why there's nothing that can surpass those multiverse hypotheses. And the evidence for the multiverse is the inflationary models, and because we have evidence for the inflation, and all inflationary models predict a multiverse, and there is a multiverse.
Yeah.
So,
My friend, you've got more faith than I do. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yep.
So it's been really interesting to see the argument kind of change forms over the years. So I was really interested when you had the physical nature of the resurrection as a bedrock fact here. So have you done any studies on just how wide the consensus is that, resurrection meant something that was empirically observable, verifiable in theory among scholars? So what's like the historians' consensus on this?
Okay, so kind of what I'm understanding your question to be, what are the consensus amongst historians today about being able to verify a miracle?
No, about like what resurrection meant. Yeah.
Yeah, now N.T. Wright did probably the best work on that in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, in 2003. And in there, he surveys all this ancient literature, and he comes to the conclusion that pretty much if you're the view outside of Judaism of the afterlife was that you become a disembodied spirit.
Mm-hmm.
If you were, and most of them, you became a disembodied spirit, a shade in the underworld, and kind of like you weren't really sleeping, but you weren't really fully cognizant.
Like the fields of asphodel in Greek mythology.
Yeah. So you're the shade, and it's not a pleasant existence, but it's a disembodied existence. And so that's kind of the now later on the Romans had a thought, and some others, that you could go to a pleasant afterlife, like what we would call heaven, right? But it was still spiritual. It was disembodied existence. But the Jews, when they said resurrection, they meant it embodied the reconstitution of the corpse and then made immortal. It wasn't until later on the Gnostics and some others that would believe that it was disembodied existence in the 2nd century and afterward, that they would think of resurrection as disembodied. But the Jews, up until that time, thought of it in bodily existence. Now, that's what Wright said, and I think he's right on with that. I don't think that is just a knockdown argument, though, like airtight, because if the Gnostics and some others could change it, how do we know that the Christians didn't? And that's why I say, well, You look at what Paul says. He's our earliest writer. He's preaching what the Jerusalem apostles are preaching. And then it's entirely consistent. I haven't mentioned the Gospels, but all their resurrection narratives is bodily resurrection, leaving behind an empty tomb. So we have every reason to think that when the Christians referred to resurrection, it meant something that happened to the corpse.
Yeah. So do you happen to know off the top of your head if these other later Gnostic sources or other Roman sources used the term like anastasis, or I think it's ageros, the other one, to describe?
Anastasis and agero, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the Gospel of Thomas does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And that's quasi-Gnostic.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
The two
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
My question is concerning. I don't know if it was listed among the 6 facts that you put up on the screen, but what are some of the historical reasons for believing that Jesus was buried and his tomb was empty?
Okay. Well, in terms of the burial, it's certainly consistent with the burial, proper burial in a tomb. It's certainly consistent with what we find of burial practices in Jerusalem then. So we know that the Romans typically, they tended to leave a person on a cross for days. And even after they were dead, they would remove the corpses and then throw them into a common pit and let the scavengers, dogs, birds, insects, come and feed off the corpses. It was a dishonorable burial. You thrown in this common grave. But Jerusalem was an exception to that. How do we know this? Well, number one, in 1967, I believe it was, they found the crucified remains of a guy named Yehohanan in an ossuary. So what an ossuary was, these stone boxes, and you would put someone in a tomb and come back a year later after decomposition had happened, gather the bones, put them in these boxes, and then give the boxes a burial. They have found over 1,000 of these in Jerusalem. And these ossuaries occurred between the year 30 BC and 70 AD when the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was attacked. So anyway, they found one that was buried, I think, from the 30s, named Yehohanan. He was in his 20s at the time, late 20s, I believe, and he'd been crucified. The nail was still in his ankle. So we know from archaeological evidence, and we found some more like that since. And second, Josephus, in his Jewish War, Book 4, Section 317, mentions how in the late 60s, the Idumeans came into Jerusalem and they killed a bunch of the Jews. And Josephus says they refused burial, proper burial, the Jews. They just let their bodies out there to rot. And the Jews in Jerusalem were just incensed over this because Josephus says it was the custom of the Jews up to that point to remove the crucified and give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So we know that the Romans made an exception in Jerusalem, and it makes sense that they would. They made other concessions, such as they allowed Pilate minted his own coins for Jerusalem. We have them still. I've got one dated 29 AD. They made them 29, 30, and 31. So 3 years in which Pilate minted these coins so that they did not have any images of an animal or of a person on them. So we know that at that time of Jesus, the Romans made certain concessions, probably in order to maintain peace, right? And we can see from that period, they were allowing the Jews to give proper burial to the crucified. So in terms of empty tomb, well, you've got things such as, how is it that if the body was still in the tomb, how is it that all around in Jerusalem they're proclaiming the bodily resurrection of Jesus if it's still in the tomb? That's difficult. You also have the enemies of Christianity trying to explain why the tomb was empty. So Matthew says that the Jewish leadership were saying that the disciples stole the body. Justin in the year 150 said that even to that very day, the Jewish leaders were still saying the disciples stole the body. Tertullian, at the end of the 2nd century, said the rumors going around that the gardener reburied the body of Jesus so that people coming to venerate Jesus' tomb wouldn't trample over his lettuce patch. And Celsus, sometime in the latter part of the 2nd century, said, well, they just dreamt that they saw the risen Jesus. And who are these people? We shouldn't believe them anyway because they were half frantic women. So we see that the skeptics they're not denying the empty tomb. They're trying to give an alternate explanation of why it was empty. So I think there are a number of reasons plus who are the people who are the ones reporting the empty tomb? It's women. And in the first century, a woman's testimony, whether Jew or Greek, was not highly regarded at all. So pretty much like it would be today in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, one of those, you know what I mean? So there's really good reasons to think that the tomb was empty, that Jesus received a proper burial, and that the tomb was empty.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hello, thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
My question is, as a historian, how would you account for the uncertainty around the locations of Jesus' crucifixion and burial?
Well, there is uncertainty, that's for sure. In fact, at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature this last November, there was a seminar in there I attended where the guy who's an archaeologist said, I've just accepted, most scholars, to my understanding, think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre contains the actual burial tomb of Jesus. It's not the garden tomb. And I think it's interesting that in that same church, just yards away, is where they say is the crucifixion site. So this guy he's an archaeologist, and he was saying, they might be the true site, but they may not be. It's impossible to know. He says it's somewhere within that vicinity, within maybe a couple 100 yards, but we don't know a precise site. But that shouldn't surprise us. I mean, the battle at Pharsalus, where Caesar defeated Pompey, tens of thousands of people died in that battle. And yet, we got a kind of an idea of where Pharsalus is, but they've never been able to find anything. They can't pinpoint where that battle took place, and yet tens of thousands died. You've got earlier in the first century BC, I think it was 71 AD, 71 or 78. I think it was 71, is where Crassus defeated Spartacus. And Plutarch reports that they built a wall. Crassus built a wall that was 40 miles long to hem in Spartacus. And while it's probably exaggeration, but it's probably still quite a wall. And yet not a scrap of that remains. We don't know exactly where it was. Alexander, when he went into India, he built 12 towers, each of which was 75 feet tall, altars in order to commemorate the occasion. Not a scrap of that remains. So we don't know exactly where they're at. So, we don't know exactly where the crucifixion or resurrection took place. We probably know the vicinity, but can't pinpoint it.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Years.
How you doing?
Good.
I just wanted to shake your hand.
I'm
I'm just messing. I'm messing with you. I wanted to shake your hand too, but this is regarding, because you teach history. This is regarding the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
And this is more so. I believe I don't have to be convinced of it. I believe in it myself, but I just want to hear your take on it. What are your feelings on the Shroud of Turin? And I know, they said that as far as I believe the head garment was folded up. Was it folded up? And according to Jewish custom, that means that the person's going to come back to where they came from. Is what they used to do that when they eat. Like the man used to do that when he used to fold his napkin up, and that indicates that he's going to return to the table. So that itself, when Jesus folded that showed that he was going to come back. That's what it's said to be of the Turin or whatever. So, and then they also tested the blood on the Turin, and they said that it has the rarest blood that you could possibly have as a human being. Type AB. As I've been told, or as I researched or whatever, I just wanted to see what your take was on it, and if what I'm saying, because I think that's a part of history.
I'm not an expert on the shroud, but from what I've read on it, it seems to me that it's probably authentic. And what's interesting, if it is, it's a photograph of the resurrection.
Yeah.
Now, the big thing that called it into question was the carbon-14 testing from, I think it was 1988. But there's an interesting story behind that carbon-14 testing. Even the guy, I can't remember his name, but he was an atheist physicist, and he's the guy that developed carbon-14 testing. And he was a strong objector to the reliability of the results of that test, the way it was conducted. Strong. If you want to read more about that, a few years ago, 3 years, maybe 4 years ago, I forgot which, David Beck and I co-edited a festschrift for Gary Habermas. It's called Raised on the Third Day. There's a number of contributors. We contributed, a number of others. One of the contributors in there, and his chapter is worth the price of the book. His name's Barry Schwartz. He's a Jew. He is not a Christian. He's an agnostic. He was the official photographer of the Shroud of Turin research project. So he's actually seen it. He's been like one of the very few people that's actually photographed it. And his chapter, again, he's a Jewish agnostic, and his chapter just eviscerates the carbon-14 testing that was done. It's not that the carbon-14 testing is bad. It's the way it was conducted. And like I said, even the guy that invented it, who is an atheist physicist, said it's not trustworthy the way that they did it. So the only thing that has really dispelled the authenticity of the shroud has been discredited. And yet you've got all these reasons for believing that it's authentic, and we can't even reproduce it today. So I tend to think that it's authentic, but I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah, because it's pretty powerful. I mean,
I think
it
so.
looks like Jesus. I mean, you know, and they've done a lot of studies on it. And I mean, it's not just a regular burial cloth that someone did a Photoshop on or something like that. So yeah, it's pretty powerful. Thank you very much, sir.
You're
God
welcome,
bless you.
brother.
Try to make this quick, in the last one. But I encountered someone a couple months ago that came to me with, and I'd never met someone who would use this argument against me, but the idea that God had committed some sort of cosmic child abuse by sending a son down to die and have a punishment that he never, for an action that he never committed. And they reference, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and prays to the Father and says, I don't remember the exact wording, but let this cup pass from me, your will, not mine. What would be your argument against that, as if to suggest that they had two different kinds of will?
Yeah. Well, yeah, two different kinds of will. To explain the Trinity is not an easy thing, right? But now this isn't an example of the Trinity, but here's kind of how I might think of it. Let's say I'm out in the country and maybe I wanted to watch the eclipse, right? And I go out in the country, and as I'm out on the field, I pulled my hands out of my pocket at one point, and my keys come out, and I dropped on the ground. And so I'm looking for my keys. Oh, they fell down this little hole like this. And I'm looking down that hole and thinking, oh man, I don't want to stick my hand down there. Maybe there's a snake down there or some critter that's going to bite me. And, but I got to do it because I can't get out of here without my keys. So I have to do it. Now, my hand is different than my head. I mean, we're connected. And it's like my head is telling my hand to do it. You got to do that. You got to reach down and get those keys. It's for our benefit. But my hand doesn't want to do it because my hand knows that it might get bitten by something. So my hand submits to what my head is saying, but it's still, we're still like, it's doing my will. I'm wanting it to do it, but at the same time, it's not wanting to do it. So there's no perfect analogy, but I mean, the thing about child abuse, come on, that's just rhetoric.
Yeah.
And no matter what worldview, you can come up with some disrespectful rhetoric, but rhetoric doesn't change facts.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
I actually have one. I was reading in Alistair McGrath. I can't remember what book it wrote. He talked about the benefit of a plurality of schematics and then having them resonate with one another. because not one single thing like history or physics or philosophy can explain what that. From your perspective as a historian, what is your reaction to McGrath's argument that that's a really good idea? He was talking about the relationship of science and faith, but your piece, the relationship between history and faith.
Whew, I don't know how to repeat this one. So there's a relationship between science and faith. There's a relationship, I'm presenting a relationship between history and faith. Yeah, for me, I'm not sure what your question is, but I'll just answer it how I think. But, so for me, now it's not this way with everyone. For my dad, he was a hardcore Calvinist. I'm not a Calvinist, but he was a hardcore Calvinist. And for him, there was, evidence didn't mean anything to him. If the Holy Spirit convinced you that Christianity is true, you know it was true. You never doubted. He never doubted. And I'd point out to him, well, John the Baptist doubted. Abraham doubted. Jesus didn't get down on John the Baptist for doubting. In fact, he said no. While he was doubting, he said, no greater man has been born of woman than John the Baptist. And he provided evidence for him. And what did the apostles do? They provided evidence, and they said, look, you saw the miracles of Jesus, and Jesus rose from the dead, and that we are eyewitnesses. So they presented evidence. And what did God do with the Israelites? He says, remember how God delivered you from Egypt. Remember how he parted the sea. Remember how he provided manna in the wilderness. Remember. It's evidence. So some of us just need it. I needed it. If you just believe based on faith, I'm fine with that. Good for you. But that's not all of us. Some of us need evidence. And without evidence, I don't think I would have been able to keep my Christian faith. I didn't become a Christian because of the evidence when I was 10 years old. My epistemological processes were not fully developed at that point. But I am a Christian today because of the evidence. And I was willing to give up my faith. When I was doing my doctoral research on this stuff that we've discussed, my wife can tell you that I wrestled mightily because I wanted to be as objective as possible, because I figure we don't have to fear truth. Like I said, we just have to fear that our biases will keep us from discovering it and cost us eternity. So for me, evidence is supreme. I got to have it. Yeah.
There you go.
Can I ask you? I don't normally do this. I'm very good.
Oh, don't be.
It's hard, but just talking in front of a bunch of people. I guess the man that asked about the dispute, and you may have answered this, but then I thought of my own question, so that I was half listening. But I guess when you listed the six things, and death was the first one. I guess if you believe that he died, what is the significance, I guess, of the tomb, and if it's empty or not? Because if you believe that he died, then he was dead, so he rose again. So, does that make sense?
No. No.
Saying believing that he was buried and then that he rose and that the tomb was empty, how do you explain that he was actually buried, and then how do you explain that the tomb was empty? And so I guess I was then thinking about, well, if you believe that you die, I guess does it matter where he was buried and if the tomb was empty?
Yeah, that's fair. So if we believe that he died, if we know that Jesus died, which all the evidence seems to point to it, and then he was seen alive afterward, why do we even need the story of the empty tomb? Yeah, well, notice that I didn't present that as one of the facts.
Right.
Because I agree with you. I mean, I don't think we need it. Now, if we're doing more of a comprehensive case for the resurrection of Jesus, then I would include the empty tomb. I would include the Gospels. I'd argue for the historical reliability of the Gospels. But remember, what I was doing here was I was basing my argument solely on historical bedrock.
That's brilliant.
The only part of that may not have been bedrock would have been the appearance to groups. That is just maybe just the one step above it, because you don't have virtually all who will grant the group appearances. a vast majority will grant that groups believe that they saw the risen Jesus. Vast majority will grant that, but not 90 to 100% for the historical bedrock. So everything else is historical bedrock. That's why I didn't include that. I wanted to make it as tight as possible, not as exhaustive as possible.
Would you consider the shroud as a historical bedrock?
Would I consider the shroud as historical bedrock? No.
That's pretty hard to simulate if it wasn't the Lord. Like, how else would that happen?
Well, yeah, it's just, in order to be historical bedrock, it's got to be, as Paula Fredrickson calls it, facts past doubting. And there are many skeptical scholars who doubt the shroud. So even if you're one of the people who think it's authentic, I do, but there are many who don't think that. Those that are facts past doubting, you don't have many people doubting it. Yes, sir.
Your talks about historical bedrock is beyond doubting. And you mentioned Jesus' death on a cross. But I'm thinking, isn't official Muslim doctrine that Jesus didn't die on a cross? So wouldn't that be what Muslims are about, like a third of the population? Wouldn't that be about a third of scholars, proportionally, that would claim he didn't die on the cross?
Well, okay. So the question, in case I think this is being recorded. So, what you have said is, if facts past doubting, if Muslims are about 1/3 of the population of the world, is that, you said that's, well, there are a lot, right? A significant population of the world, that scholars, maybe a third of scholars would be that. And so you wouldn't have facts past doubting a large majority of scholars. Well, yeah, there are a significant percentage of the world population, but in terms of historians of Jesus, I really don't know many Muslims who are historians of Jesus. And we're talking about historians of Jesus who really study this stuff. Even now, I've debated Shabir Ali 3 times. He used to be, maybe still is, the leading Muslim debater in the world. Guy's really smart. And even Shabir acknowledged in our first debate, you can watch it online, go to my YouTube channel, they're all on there. Shabir acknowledged in our first debate that he was not going to be basing his position on the Quran, because he was going to be doing it on faith, because he didn't have evidence for it. He didn't have evidence to support the Quran's view there, historical evidence. So, in fact, I think the view of the Quran is easily refuted. So in addition to all the evidence that does point to the death of Jesus, I mean, yeah, they could come back and say, yeah, but God made it, as the Quran says, God made it appear that he died, but took him to heaven instead. So the historical evidence only suggests that God was successful in convincing people that he had died on the cross. But then what I would respond is saying, let's look at this from a theological perspective. One, I can make a very strong case that Jesus predicted his imminent death. And he said he had to die because of the scriptures. So he's teaching as a prophet that he had to die. Now, if Jesus did not die as he predicted and as he taught, then he was a false prophet. But the Quran says he was a good prophet, a great prophet. So the Quran would be mistaken that he was a good prophet, great prophet. But if he did die, if he actually died as he predicted, then the Quran is mistaken because it says he didn't. Either way, the Quran is mistaken. So that's one thing I'd point out. Another thing I'd point out is we can understand, we know that the apostles truly believed that he died and rose from the dead. Why didn't God correct them? Why did he allow them to continue to believe a lie and then create the largest religion in the world? That doesn't seem to be very wise of the supposed all-wise God. Now, we can understand why God would deceive the Jews who had Jesus executed and the Romans who executed him. But since the Christians, his followers, his disciples, whom the Quran refers to as Muslims, by the way, why would he deceive them? And if he's deceiving those Muslims, how do you know that God is not deceiving you now? So there's a number of reasons to reject the Quran on the fate of Jesus. Yes, sir.
So you picture. So, you mentioned one why one of the evidence is the resurrection was through where that the also the best even everything, right? So that they went on to die after that.
Well, first of all, they claimed it, right? We've got multiple sources tied to them that claimed it, but also that they believed it is suggested by the fact that they were willing to suffer intense persecution and were even willing to go to their deaths.
That's my question is some fictions, but are there other like arguments, evidence? There's a difference that they got something else out there that they did believe it, but there's still something where to do that to die for it.
So are there scholars out there saying that there might have been another reason why they were willing to suffer and die? Maybe they were getting some other kind of benefits out of it.
That this or where would this authority?
Yeah. You might have some obscure scholars saying that, but I don't know of any major ones that are saying that, because one of the historical bedrock is that these disciples truly believed. They had experiences that they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. They had these experiences. They really believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. So they'll posit a psychological thing like a hallucination. They'll call it vision, though, even though they're really saying hallucination. Or they'll just say, well, I don't know what it was, but it was psychological. We can know that. Say, well, no, we can't, because there's only the fact that you won't even define what it is shows that you're having problems. It's not a hallucination. It's not a delusion. It's not an illusion. You can deal with those kinds of things. So what is it? Don't try to play armchair psychologist here if you're not going to give some kind of an explanation. You know what I mean? That's what I would say back to someone like that. But I don't know of any major scholar who would deny that they truly believe that Jesus rose and appeared to them.
This
question, I guess, first of all, I heard that there's something within history called the principle of analogy.
Yeah.
Is that true? Okay.
Troitsch's principle of analogy from the early 20th century.
Okay. So going along like that line of thought, given the explanation of the resurrection and principle of analogy or principle of uniformity, whatever that may be, historically speaking, what would be good reasons to still posit the resurrection with that principle of analogy, or how that would maybe go against it?
So Troitsch's principle of analogy was, look, basically, things work today as they worked in the past. And if we don't see miracles today, then they didn't occur in the past. And I'd just simply, a couple of things I'd say to that is, number one, even if no miracles happen today, what if God wanted to do one in the past, like the resurrection, because he had a special thing going on, namely his son, raising him from the dead because inaugurating his kingdom? Well, there could be a reason for a miracle in the past, but not today. Okay. So that would be one thing I'd say. Second, I'd say, if you're going to go with the principle of analogy, then you're going to eliminate all unique events. So, you'd have to get rid of the Big Bang because it's only happened once, right? We don't see it happening today, so it probably didn't happen in the past. So wait a minute, we got evidence from the past. Yes, we sure do. That's why we believe it happened, not because it's happening today. And then I'd also say that I do think we see miracles happen today, well-evidenced miracles. And if they happen today, well, then you turn the principle of analogy on its head and say they happen today, therefore there's a really good chance they happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe still like on the resurrection specific, you broaden it to miracles or unique events in general.
Yeah.
Argue for those happening and then going back into history.
Right.
So, okay.
Because if you got miracles, then resurrection's right at home. Right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.